Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, October 22nd, 2025, and our dear friend, our dear brother, Matt Ho, is back here with us. Welcome back, Matt.
Hi, Nima. Good to see you.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And Matt, let's start with what's going on in the United States. The latest news is that the U.S. Senate Foreign Relation Committee, has approved an initiative to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And what's going on? They're talking not just about Russia, they're talking about China supporting Russia, and they're trying to, put China in that position as well.
Mhm.
What's going on, and how is it that going to help the United States and the position they're making in order, if they want to help Ukraine, is that going to help Ukraine in your opinion?
No, it's not going to help Ukraine. It's not going to help anybody, but in their own fevered, maniacal minds. This A lot of this comes from this idea of maximalist, of putting so much pressure. It comes out of the efforts that were done in the first Trump administration on maximalist pressure on Iran, and this really mistaken revisionist belief that it was successful. And that if not for the Biden administration, Iran would have collapsed by now, and there would have been regime change there, and Iranian people would be free, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, completely unfounded. One, because the Biden administration didn't reduce, any of the pressure on Iran, but also two, just because it simply doesn't have that effect. But the idea being is that this is how we have to go through the world. That we have to apply the full weight of the United States. That we've been too soft. We have to take the gloves off. And so the idea of designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism allows more sanctions to be placed on Russia, allows more limitations on interaction with Russia. It precludes a whole heck of a lot. And this is a backdoor way of, of circumventing or foiling negotiations with Russia to end the war in Ukraine, as well as larger security issues. If you designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, then the United States cannot negotiate with Russia on arms control. So, how do you extend the New START treaty that's going to end in February 2026? Well, most of these men and women in Congress don't want to see the New START treaty extended. They don't want to see nuclear weapons capped at 1,500 warheads each. They want to be, a bonanza, right? And just allow the weapons companies and the nuclear industry to be back at the trough, right, of unbridled arms race. There's a lot of motives here. There's a lot of reasons for it. There's a lot of hidden hands involved in this, but it comes back to this fever, this mania, this insanity in Washington D.C. that it's an imperial one. Certainly, the idea that the United States cannot allow any challenge to its dominance, that it cannot accept any type of affront or any type of impertinence, or that it cannot get its way, then that's an imperial one. You would have seen that in Rome 2,000 years ago, kind of thing. You would have seen it in London 150 years ago, right? I mean, so some of this is just natural, organic to empire. Other aspects of it are peculiar to the United States and to those types we have here in power, like Lindsey Graham, who is one of the chief proponents of these types of things. This, of course, is going along with or in parallel to the desire by Graham, and I think he has more. I think he has 75 co-sponsors in the Senate to put 500% tariffs on anyone who is importing Russian oil. Right, so the Indians, say the Turks, whoever, would have 500% tariffs put on them. And just to finally cap it off, this is, as often occurs, conjoined with uh, action. So, as we saw in this last week, the explosions at the Romanian and Hungarian right oil facilities that have been taking in Russian oil. All of this is part of an overall plan that they believe will somehow push Russia to collapse. It's not even about getting Russia to negotiate an end to the war. These people don't care about that. They don't care about seeing an end. Actually, I would expect many of them want to see the war continue for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's the profits of the weapons industry or because they like the idea of Russian soldiers being killed. But what they think this type of pressure will do will isolate Russia, will make its economy hurt, and that ultimately there'll be such pressures on Russia that its government will collapse. And then, the Americans and the West will finally have won the great victory in Russia they've been trying to achieve since the 1990s.
Matt, the Trump administration, they've been in power. It's been 10 months, almost 10 months they're in power in the United States. So far, what's your assessment on them? Can Trump, this is the question that I ask our audience who are watching us right now.
Mm.
Can Trump deliver peace? Do you see any sort of sign that this administration would go in that direction?
I don't know. I mean, Donald Trump loves to throw out that stat. I think he's now up to 8 wars he has ended. I mean, according to him, when people pull that apart, it gets completely debunked. He's still claiming he solved the war in Congo, and Congo, is what I'm reading, is as bloody as it's ever been. I mean, but we're dealing with a man who's in his own reality, and people around him in a movement that see themselves as revolutionaries. Right. So the idea of the world that they're creating, oftentimes for people like that, it has its own lexicon. It has its own meaning. And so what does peace mean to them? We can certainly go back and look at what Tacitus reports, Germanicus, I believe it was Germanicus, the Scottish chieftain. I guess they were Caledonians back then, who, said of the Romans, they create a desert and declare it peace. I mean, is that essentially what we have here? That's what we have certainly with the Israeli-American understanding of what's occurring in Gaza. They've destroyed Gaza. Gaza is gone, essentially. I mean, 2+ million people are still there, but Gaza as a physical location in terms of any relation to what once was is gone. And that they declare peace, right? I mean, so not the Palestinians in Gaza, excuse me, but the Israelis, Americans. So, whether or not they actually want peace, these revolutionaries who are in power, the MAGA movement, the America First movement, Trump and his cabinet, however you want to describe them as, is a good question. And, you see the way that Trump vacillates on things, and you see the way that he has no principles, that he is not anchored in anything. He is incredibly malleable. I mean, we could talk about Ukraine, right? And the way he goes from going into the meeting with Putin in Anchorage back in August, where, we need a ceasefire, to coming out of that meeting, no ceasefire, to just this past week, we need a ceasefire again, right? And that supposedly is what scuttled the talks between him and Putin that were scheduled for Hungary. Hungary, of course, that's a whole other thing we can get into, how anyone expected Putin to get to Hungary overflying all the EU nations. I don't know, but again, these are people who live in their own reality, right? So I don't know, so the whole thing is just madness that we're trying to comprehend. Right. We're trying to approach irrational people. Again, people who view themselves as revolutionaries. We would refer to them as reactionaries, but who see themselves as revolutionaries. We're trying to understand them. We're trying to decipher. And it's really difficult to do. And, all of us who are trying to do this, we all need to give ourselves a break and lessen the pressure off of us if we're not perfect or we don't get things correct, because we have, at least in my life, never seen an administration, a government that is like the one we have right now in terms of its just lack of adherence to anything other than, as my friend Karen Kiritosky said just today in an email, she described it as profit seeking. This is the goals of this administration: profit seeking, cronyism, and cheap wars overseas for natural resources. That seems to be the principles or the goals or the foundation upon which this government adheres to, and I think that's probably it, right? I mean, so it's tough to understand whether or not they really want peace or not. And one final thing is that, certainly this idea of Donald Trump wanting the Nobel Peace Prize, that seems to be real. That doesn't seem to be something exaggerated, right? That doesn't seem to be like something, just some kind of rumor that was cooked up, or some story, or some, just little part of presidential lore, like William H. Taft once couldn't get
He's
out of the
dead
bathtub because he was
serious
so
about
fat.
that, man.
Yeah, he's serious, dead serious about it. And so that then comes into this calculation of, what will Donald Trump do with respect to Israel and Iran? Certainly, the Israelis want the Americans to take part in a war again in Iran. And, whether or not that would preclude Donald Trump from getting the Nobel Peace Prize in, next October, that's a real factor. I mean, it's insane that we're saying this and that this is a thing that we have to really contend with, but it's actually true. Whether he really wants peace, I don't know. I think for these men and women in power, it goes to the Dostoevsky quote about how power and blood is humiliating, how tyranny is organic, how very often men and women who come into contact with it find it intoxicating. And I think that's what you have here. And I would say, just to continue rambling on, moving to Venezuela, the goal, as I think, as I view more what's happening in Venezuela, and I could be proven wrong in a few hours tonight when it gets dark and the U.S. launches an invasion or something. But I don't think that's the case. One, I don't think the forces are there for such a thing. But also, two, I think this is a type of government. These are the type of men and women who like the theater. They like the optics of killing people in speedboats. They like being able to once a week release the video of another boat getting destroyed by a Hellfire missile or whatever. They like that. There's a Tom Clancy-esque aspect to all this that they enjoy. And I think that is what they're going after here, more than actual regime change, certainly more than any occupation of Venezuela. If they could get regime change in Venezuela, then, so be it. God bless it for them, right? Venezuela, of course, has been a target for the neoconservatives, particularly the Republicans, for decades now. This has been an obsession of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And Venezuela, of course, also has the world's largest oil reserves. So, I mean, you put all this together, in this very long-winded response, and you still come to a point with regards to Trump as to whether or not he wants peace or not, as something as, how he's feeling at whatever time during the day. And this is why this administration is so incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. Here is Matt. You mentioned the situation in Venezuela. Here is what Rand Paul said about Venezuela.
There is no fentanyl made in Venezuela. Not just a little bit. There's none being made in Venezuela. These are outboard boats that, in order for them to get to Miami, would have to stop and refuel 20 times. They're in all likely going to Trinidad and Tobago, which is an island right off of the coast of Venezuela. So there's a lot of reasons to be worried about this. But number one is the broader principle of, when can you kill people indiscriminately? When you're at war. That's why when we declare war, it's supposed to be done by Congress. It's supposed to be thoughtful. It's supposed to be debated. And we're not supposed to do it willy-nilly. And then when you have war, you just kill people in the war zone. And even then there are rules of engagement. But interdicting drugs has always been a criminal activity and a criminal anti-crime sort of activity, where we don't just summarily execute people. We actually present evidence and convict them.
Matt, what's happening considering Donald Trump himself? These people, Rand Paul was one of them, who was supporting, one of the few Republicans supported Donald Trump during the Russia Gate. And we have Thomas Massie, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene. These people are part of the Republican Party who supported Donald Trump. Right now, they don't agree with what Donald Trump is doing. And it seems Donald Trump feels so much closer to Lindsey Graham than these people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Isn't that a concern in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, and that's not the way it was supposed to be, right? I mean, a core tenet of Donald Trump's MAGA movement is America first. And certainly men like his men and women like his Vice President J.D. Vance, or his Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who we've heard nothing from in the last last several months. I was told she was brought out for a Diwali ceremony, and that was it. You have this abandonment of this principle of putting America's interests at the top of our agenda. And that's simply not shown to be the case. I mean, we could talk about this $40 billion bailout from Argentina. That's not even meant to shore up the Argentinian economy, right? I mean, Trump himself has said it. It all hinges on the upcoming elections as to whether or not this money goes through or whether there'll be any additional support. So it shows that it's just a political, it's cronyism, as Karen Kwiatkowski said, profit-seeking, cronyism, and cheap wars overseas for natural resources. I love that she wrote that to me today, because I feel like I need to quote it all over the place, because they feel like she really nailed it in terms of putting together what is the agenda here. So you see these outliers in the Republican Party who've not given up their principles, who've not traded their beliefs for a comfortable spot either in the administration or guaranteed campaign support, and so that's why you'll see such efforts against Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we've had this in the past. I mean, certainly when George W. Bush was president, you had Rand Paul's father, Ron Paul, leading the efforts against the Iraq War. Walter Jones, the late congressman from North Carolina, who I'm blessed to have been able to call him a friend. Mr. Jones, after turning around from his initial support for that war, went against the war, and he paid severely in Congress in terms of just being able to hold on to his seat, but also never holding any of the seniority positions he should have held, because he was going to go with his principles and not what was best for either George W. Bush or John Boehner or whoever else, in the Republican leadership. So what you see with Greene, Massie, Paul is pretty rare. And, you could see with Paul in particular and Massie, I don't know Greene as well, but these are men who are libertarians. So they are in their own outlier section of the Republican Party. They are not mainstream GOP by any means. They are traditionally anti-war. They are traditionally very much civil libertarians. And so with Paul in his comments, in addition to what we just heard him talking to Piers Morgan, he makes his point about how can you murder somebody without even knowing their names? We're killing people in these speedboats. We don't even know what their names are. And he uses the point that is incredibly un-American to do such a thing, to carry out such an act like that, to execute somebody without, knowing that person's name. I mean, that's the height of a lack of due process. So, it's good that we still have these men and women like Massie and Paul and Greene. It's a shame that you see so few of these on the Democratic Party side. I mean, you have efforts by the Democrats to try and restrict what Donald Trump is doing with regards to these strikes in the Caribbean. And actually now today, they hit a boat in the Pacific that was coming from Colombia. So now it's a multi-ocean war on drugs here. But so Tim Kaine, Rand Paul put forward basically a war powers resolution, that seeks to curtail the president's ability to conduct these operations. And that's going to go the same way all the other war powers resolutions have gone. And the Democrats know that, and that's all they'll do. And so there won't be any real effort at undermining this. There won't be any real effort at, say, blocking any of Trump's other actions, whether it's, blocking funding for this type of thing. There won't be any of that. It'll be just like as we saw with the opposition throughout all other aspects of war or the previous administrations who have just tremendously violated civil liberties, American civil liberties. So, I think we've seen the same script in terms of what we can expect from Congress on this. It's just that Donald Trump is providing a lot more color and flavor to it in a way that we haven't seen before.
Matt, when it comes to Gaza, it seems that J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner are pushing a plan to split Gaza in two parts. One of them is under the control of Israel, the other one under the control of Hamas. And the U.S.-backed construction reconstruction limit is going to be limited to the Israeli side. And is that mean that they're not going to let anybody to help, the Hamas side, as they have in their mind, to help these people to rebuild their, their homes, their houses, their apartment buildings? How is that going to influence? Are they going to make some sort of, a zone with a better quality of life? That's why to convince the people in Gaza and in the part under the control of Hamas to come over to the other part. What is that? What is in their mind, in your opinion?
Yeah, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago on my Substack, what I expected this peace plan to look like if it holds. And there's a great uncertainty as to whether or not it's going to hold or not. Plenty of Israelis throughout their society, throughout their government, military, media, don't want to see this to go forward, including quite possibly Benjamin Netanyahu. So there's that, right? That this may not even go forward, that it will fall apart, and the Israelis will resume the genocide and ethnic cleansing as they saw fit. But there's also those more, I think, calmer minded or more rational minded Israelis who still want to carry out the ethnic cleansing, but see the opportunity to do it in a way that the Americans and other nations are fully involved with. So take some of the burden off the Israelis, right? Allow the Israelis then to focus on annexing the West Bank and whatever else they want to do. But the idea being is that you create Gaza to look essentially like the West Bank, that it is essentially a strip of Bantustans, of enclaves, of where these cities once were. They're essentially concentration camps, which and then the roads that divide them are apartheid roads that keep the Palestinians separate, of course, from the Israelis, but also in a way one step beyond what the Israelis were able to do in the West Bank, say following the Oslo Accords, is keep them separate from other Palestinians. So as you see in the West Bank, you see the Israelis making a real effort in the last decade or so with their settlements to really cut up the West Bank, really try and limit interaction between, or limit communication, contact from one Palestinian area to another within the West Bank. That's essentially what they want to get done in Gaza as well. And so you'd have these, concentration camps, if you will, built upon the once, built upon large neighborhoods or upon the cities, divided from each other, unable to really connect with one another. And then outside of those areas, as you were saying, this is where the Israelis will rebuild. And how much will the Americans be involved in this? Jared Kushner certainly is there for this reason. This is why he was brought back into these efforts by this administration with regards to Israel and Palestine, and I'm assuming probably maybe the broader Middle East. But the idea to develop it then. And so then you get the question of which becomes the priority then in these areas that are going to be redeveloped. Does it become Trump's towers, or is it settlers' caravans and trailers that are the priority? So you can imagine even this conflict between the Israelis and Americans down the road of settlers wanting where the towers or where the Trump towers are going to go, and back and forth. So this idea that, or certainly, and Kushner said this as well just yesterday or 2 days ago, that the reconstruction will occur in Israeli controlled areas. I think the idea of seeing Gaza as a mini West Bank, as a as an area of Bantustans, of disconnected from one another, concentration camps essentially, that makes sense for both the Israelis and the Americans. And then of course those areas where the Palestinians are concentrated in, say in Gaza City or Khan Yunis. I don't know if they'll ever really be allowed back in Rafah, but say if they're kept like the Al Mawasi area on the coast there near Rafah, you can see how they can then be controlled, how the amount of food, the amount of materials, the amount of water, just anything going into them will be regulated. So just as the Israelis, with their occupation of Gaza by blockade and siege over the last couple of decades, were able to do that through the whole strip, they'll do this in a targeted way to enforce their control over areas that they don't control, essentially, right? Over areas that are still controlled by Hamas. And the idea of the Palestinians giving up their sovereignty, giving up any form of resistance to occupation is an unfounded one, is one that's ludicrous. And so this idea of Hamas disarming, now you get this whole thing of what's Israeli controlled, what's Hamas controlled, is ridiculous. And Hamas has said so. We're not going to disarm unless there is a pathway to a Palestinian state. And the Israelis have said that there is no pathway to a Palestinian state. The government, the Knesset, the military, the media, all throughout Israel, completely opposed to a Palestinian state. So you see this conflict then that is just there. It has been there for decades and will continue to inspire the desire for ethnic cleansing by Israel, because if the Palestinians won't submit, then they have to leave. And this gets back to what many in Israel have claimed to be the three solutions for the Palestinians. Either have them assimilate and become third or fourth class citizens, have them leave and go someplace else, or have them killed. And I don't see any reasoning why that won't continue to be the Israeli policy towards Palestine going forward, just because Jared Kushner is partnered with Larry Ellison and they're going to spend $350 million to build resorts and high-rise towers and AI data centers in Gaza, as they have declared they're going to do. I don't see how that changes the overall Israeli calculation for Palestine, whether it be Gaza, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank.
I don't know how the Arab states are feeling about the whole situation with these sort of plans on the part of Jared Kushner, because after all, the Arab states, it seems they have to pay for all these reconstruction projects. They're going to pay it, and they're going to pay specifically, they pay, to reconstruct something for Israel, not for Gazans, for Palestinians. They're paying for something that Israel would get, it would benefit from it in a long run. It's not just anything about Palestinians, about anything about peace. How are they convinced to go in that direction?
Well, anytime I get confused about the Arab states, Nima, I think about who their leaders are, and I think about how corrupt they are, right? How weak they ultimately are, how their own preservation is the only thing that comes to their minds. So I don't see an issue with the Arabs continuing to betray the Palestinians. I mean, you have the dictator Sisi in Europe today meeting with EU leaders. He's not a representative of the Palestinians. He's not even a representative of the Egyptian people. He's a representative of his regime. And so I think under keeping that in mind, who these men are, who rule these countries, who lead these countries, the examples they provide to us in the past are what we can expect of them in the future. And so the willingness of the Gulf states to work with the Americans and the Israelis, I think that's just a foregone conclusion. You had a story the other day in the Washington Post about how the Gulf states militaries are working with the Israelis, not indirectly, like through an intermediary, an American. I mean, Americans are certainly the ones who glue them together, but have been in meetings together. They've been in planning sessions together. I don't think you're going to see joint, Omani Israeli Navy patrols or anything like that. But there is a collusion, there is a complicity with the Israeli government by the Arab leaders that is insidious, that is nefarious, and that is explicit. It's there, and it's not going to change. I mean, the idea for, I think, the Arab states is how best do we put this charade around it? How best do we dress it up to look as if we care about the Palestinians without losing the ability to go back to business as usual as it was on October 6, 2023? These are all leaders who, for the most part, joined the Abraham Accords because they saw it was a good deal for them. And the Abraham Accords explicitly left the Palestinians to disillusion, that left the Palestinians to a fate that spurred, and Hamas has said this, the rationale to attack on October 7th, to make sure the world hadn't forgotten them, because certainly the Arab states once again had demonstrated with the Abraham Accords that they were going to forget the Palestinians. And even the nations that didn't sign it, like the Saudis, it's very transparent. They were very transparent. They tried to make it seem as if, we care about the Palestinians. Nah, the whole issue with that was about getting nuclear technology, getting a defense alliance with the military alliance with the Americans. The Saudis just wanted more out of the Abraham Accords than they were getting. That's all it was. Had nothing to do with the Palestinians. So, when we look at this in terms of going forward, what can we expect? Certainly, if the business is good, if the profit is there, then certainly. And so the Gulf leaders fall into that thing again. I'll quote my friend Karen again, right? Profit seeking, cronyism, and cheap wars for natural resources. And essentially that you can get at least two of those three things by, continuing to throw the Palestinians to the side.
Yeah. They're talking about Jordan Valley that is, close in the West Bank, that Israel is gonna, annex officially. And these are not, we are not talking about, it seems that there was a discussion in Israel about this, the annexation of Jordan Valley. And the leaders of opposition in Israel, they voted in favor of that plan. It seems that it doesn't matter who's going to be in power in Israel, Matt, after all.
Right.
I think it doesn't matter. The outcome would be the same.
Right. Exactly. I'm struggling right now. There is a great Yair Lapid quote from a week or two ago that demonstrated exactly it. That type of idea that there is no difference among those in power in Israel or those with the potential to take power in Israel with regards to the Palestinians, with regards to the occupied territories. There is no difference. There is no one of any political significance in Israel that is in favor of anything resembling a two-state solution, as anything in favor of resembling the rights of the Palestinians, certainly not in favor of the right of return or anything like that. You had two members of the Knesset who got booted out when Donald Trump was there last week. One of them was an Israeli Jewish member of the Knesset who held up a sign, "Recognize Palestine." And so God bless him, but, he has no significance. He has no power. His movement is quite small. And even when you start to cut through that as well, you start to see that very often the arguments for recognizing Palestine from the Israeli side, the extreme minority that exists to have that, oftentimes are couched in terms of, times are couched in terms of Israeli national security, of what's best for Israel, that this would stabilize the situation. We need to recognize Palestine. We need to do something about the occupation because this is too onerous for us. This is too burdensome. This is just causing security issues for us that we can avoid by leaving these people alone. It says nothing at all about the Palestinians, about their rights, about the crimes committed against them, about international law, about natural law, about any of it. And so very often, even with the Israelis who are in favor of the limited number, that are in favor of some type of political solution to this, you find that their rationale is self-serving and not in accordance with anything that's, referencing the rights of the Palestinians, international law, natural law, etc.
Matt, do you think that with the case of Russia, the meeting was somehow, it seems that they were talking about the meeting between Lavrov and Rubio, which was later on, they have decided to go with the phone call before the meeting. It seems that the main issue still is the ceasefire. They want ceasefire in Ukraine, which is not the case for Russia. And how far Europe can go with the case of Russian asset, in your opinion, to force the situation, to force Russia, to put pressure on Russia?
I think tomorrow, Thursday, I think isn't that when they're voting to whether or not they're going to take the Russian assets to pay for that
Tomorrow.
$165 billion. I can't remember if it's $165 billion or euros massive loan to the Ukrainians, which, the madness in all of this, Nima. I think maybe we spoke about this a week or two ago, but just to reinforce this, the European commissioner, I can't remember his name right now, but who's in charge of the budget for the EC. He has said that European unions don't need to have this $165 billion loan on their books because it's going to be paid for by the Russians in reparations when the war is over. I mean, so you've got this madness, you've got this sickness, this insanity that is even having their budget people say, eventually we're going to win the war and the Russians are going to pay reparations, so we don't have to do good and sound and legal accounting right now, right? I mean, this is the type of mania that is running throughout Europe right now that comes from the top down. Certainly it's not being pushed up by the people, as we can see by the public opinion polls. But, this idea that somehow they're going to take this money from Russian frozen assets in violation of international law. The banks are against this. There seems to be nothing good that can come from this, whether it's the precedent it sets or the fact that the Russians have said we'll retaliate. The Europeans claim they have $300 billion in Russian assets. The Russians are saying we have about $300 billion in European assets that are frozen that we can control, and we're going to take that then. I mean, so the idiocy here, right? The lunacy of escalating it like this. Where do they think it's going to go? The West has been outmatched by Russia for 3.5 years now. What was declared 3.5 years ago as a war that would be decided through essentially the factories and the plants and the refineries of the West versus Russia has proven to have failed. It's been lost. You look at the scale and the scope of Russian manufacturing capacity in terms of supporting their army in Ukraine versus what the West has been able to do for Ukraine. And it's 2, 3 times, 4 times, maybe even more, depending upon what you want to look at. You look at the advancement in technologies. You look at the overall performance of their militaries. Be clear, the Russian generals defeated the American generals. As we know, the American generals have been controlling the Ukrainian army from command posts in Germany throughout this war. That the big arrow decisions made by the Ukrainian army are actually made by American generals. The American generals faced off against the Russian generals in this war, and they have lost. And so rather than recognizing the reality and finding a way to get out of it, finding an off-ramp that includes maybe some face saving, certainly I understand why the Europeans and Americans would want to save face in this. I'm all for that, if it means that the war ends. But they choose to continue this war in a way that makes any end to it worse than what they could have achieved by negotiating for an end. So the madness here, I think this whole loan, stealing it from the Russian assets, it's just part and parcel of the whole of all the aspects of this war, right? Again, the lunacy of it, the false hope of it, the legal aspects of it, and I think when you get to this thing about the Rubio Lavrov talks being canceled, I think the reality is that simply as you said, Nima, that why meet? There's no reason to discuss anything. We still have come nowhere since Anchorage, and maybe the Russians feel betrayed a bit because Donald Trump left the Anchorage talk saying, yes, we need a long-term peace plan. We don't need a ceasefire. And then he turns around and does this, as well as we brought it up briefly before, but things like when you blow up refineries in your own allies countries, Romania and Hungary, members of the EU, members of NATO, when you blow up their own refineries, and these are refineries and facilities that were processing Russian oil. So the Russians didn't do it. Why would they do that? Same thing with Nord Stream. What is your adversary to make of that? How are they supposed to move forward with you if you're blowing up your own allies' facilities? I mean, so I'm not sure the timing with that, if that could have come into play or not with the decision on the Russian side. But certainly, if I was on the Russian side, you want to negotiate with these madmen? Look, we have the upper hand in Ukraine. It's going slowly, but it's going surely. All the metrics point to eventual Ukrainian collapse in a year, 2, 3 years' time. I'm much more conservative than some other people. I think the Ukrainians can hold on for 2 or 3 more years, particularly with Western backing, keeping that balloon inflated, right? As long as the Ukrainians can figure out their manpower issues. So as you've heard, these maniacs, these hawks here in the US say, like Lindsey Graham, start drafting your 18-year-olds, because if people aren't familiar, the Ukrainians don't draft ages 18 to 25. 26 is when they start drafting. So it's very different than anything most people are familiar with. But, the idea of, can you bring in this half generation of young men into the war? That'll keep you going. That will plus up your numbers. That'll give you the 30,000 men you need a month to keep the army from collapsing, as well. Then too, if we just keep the money coming in, if you look at, say, what happened in Afghanistan or in Vietnam, what brings about the collapse of the Afghan government or Vietnamese government? It's the cutoff of funding, or the fear of the cutoff of funding, that starts the collapse of those governments. That starts the collapse of their security systems, of their militaries, right? As long as you're guaranteeing that you're going to provide this money to them, that fear of collapse won't be there. There won't be a panic that causes, the government and the economy and refugees government economic collapse and then refugees to flee. So you could see how in their minds, in Brussels, in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, and in Washington, D.C., that there's a way forward here. And then you got your fingers crossed that the Russian economy eventually does implode, because it is carrying a very large strain with this war. There's a lot of things you can look at in terms of Russia, in terms of their economic conditions, such as their debt to GDP ratio, that are very favorable for the Russians. But war puts a lot of strains on the economy, particularly the political economy of the country, particularly a foreign war. And I know people are going to say Ukraine war is not a foreign war, et cetera, et cetera. But the Russians themselves say they are fighting NATO. So this is a foreign war. So, this is the type of convolutions and the type of again, mania, for lack of a better time, that infests the minds of those in DC and Berlin and Brussels and London, et cetera, that makes them think this war is ultimately winnable, And so you look at this loan then, and if you put that type of perspective in mind, you see how this loan to Ukraine makes tremendous sense. Even though those with the outside looking in saying this makes no sense, this is ruinous, this is going to cause more problems, and it's only going to lead to what? But it's the same thing. These are the same men and women, at least on the American side, that, as we talked about before, with their domestic policies, with their war on the narco terrorists, they see themselves as revolutionaries, right? So they don't flip a switch at some point during the day and say, going into foreign policy mode, right? So a guy like Hegseth, when he advocates for the next battlefields in the United States being American cities, it's not like he has a switch and he says, okay, now it's time for my international perspective to come on, and I'm going to see the world in a much more rational and lucid manner. No, they don't. And so, this is what we're witnessing, and we're going to be forced to witness for many more years to come.
And I think Donald Trump is not honest in the way that he's talking about India, because you have to be honest about something that India is, every day they're talking about it. They're not going to give up on receiving Russian oil, because
Right.
they need the Russian oil and gas. And that's why they're receiving it, because of their security, because of the situation in their country, because of their priorities, which would be the Indian people, the Indian industry. And here is what Donald Trump said, the latest comment in India.
And you even mentioned that in a recent phone call with Prime Minister Modi, and that Modi had said his country would stop purchasing of Russian oil.
Yeah, he's going to stop purchasing.
But India said that they were not aware.
Well, then they're going to just keep paying a lot of tariffs.
Did you have the phone
if they said
call,
that, but
or-
I don't believe they said that. No, I spoke with Prime Minister Modi of India, and he said he's not going to be doing the Russian oil thing. So that's it.
But why would India say that they're not going to do it?
I don't know, but if they want want to say that, then they'll just continue to pay massive tariffs, and they don't want to do that.
How you can make things up this way? And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, I mean, he does. He does. I mean, here we go round and round trying to figure out what this country is going to do under his leadership, and it's really a fool's errand. I mean, not that right, not that we should shut it down. It's like that William Shatner clip from Airplane 2. Shut it all down. But this idea that we're supposed to try and figure out what is going to be. What the United States is going to do when this man who leads it just makes things up, and then if you're on the other side of it, the adversaries, how do you deal with that? This is reportedly in early 2024, Vladimir Putin said that he preferred to see Joe Biden remain as president than Donald Trump return, because reportedly Putin said it was because Biden was predictable. I mean, and that's true. It's true. I mean, right. I mean, you could look at Biden, you could understand what he was going to do with regards to Israel, with what he was going to do with regards to Ukraine, with how he's going to act towards China. Right. I mean, in all ways, he was going to be destructive and ruinous and counterproductive. But you could at least understand where it was coming from. Right. I mean, but with this man in power and those around him who are nothing but, he's surrounded by sycophants, or he's surrounded by con men and criminals, or he's surrounded by those who have been successful in life because they've understood how to navigate a corrupt political, economic, and media ecosystem in the U.S. So he's surrounded by people who are just like him. So it's not like he's got a secretary of war, or a treasury secretary, or a secretary of state, or homeland security, or whoever, who is concerned that the president just makes things up. Oh, they're fine with it because they make things up too. They just go along with it. I think Kristi Noem is a bastion of sanity who uses rational arguments and logic to figure out what she's going to do next. I mean, no. I mean, so again, it goes back to this idea of who do we have in power, and that you cannot trust that their decisions will be rational, and that you also have to interpret their decisions as coming from their baser instincts. So again, that Dostoevsky quote about blood and power, how it intoxicates, about how tyranny is organic and how it just grows, and how just once someone tastes that, they have a very hard time coming back from it. And you could see how they believe that their success is predicated on others like them. So here in the United States, they're recruiting ICE agents to go and terrorize not just unauthorized migrants, but legal residents and American citizens. Hundreds of American citizens have been detained, beaten, humiliated by ICE agents in the last several months. Hundreds. And they're going to get more ICE agents. They're going to expand it. We're lucky here where I am in North Carolina. They haven't shown up yet because the program hasn't expanded. They don't have enough people to expand it. But this time next year, I bet sure as heck, if anything, they'll be here. And the idea behind the Trumps, the Hegseths, the Noems, the leadership is that, in their revolutionary fervor, they will find like-minded spirits. And so whether it's Noem's thugs in goons in ICE, or whether it's Hegseth's desire to have a white, patriarchal, Christian, nationalist army, they believe they can accomplish that.
Matt, when you compare Europe to Israel today, I would argue the main supporter of Israel is the government in the United States. All of other countries, they're somehow afraid of the United States, or they have a lot with the United States that they want. That's why they support Israel. They want to negotiate, talk with Israel, or have a better relationship with Israel. Do you think that Europe is going in that direction, to be totally dependent on the United States without having the ties with the East, with Russia, with China, with the East? It's important for the future of Europe, but they don't see that necessity within the leadership I'm talking about.
Right. I mean, the current leaders in Europe, all of whom I heard, who was that? Maybe it was Alexander Macoris. I heard say that you could total up the public opinion numbers of Merz, of Starmer, of Macron, and maybe a couple others, and they still wouldn't total what Vladimir Putin's public opinion numbers are. And it shows the way that Russia has conducted itself over these last decades compared to the United States, compared to Europe. And so with the collapse of the end of the Cold War, this new world order, there is an opportunity there. There is a choice that countries could make, whether they stayed under the tutelage, remained vassals of the American empire, or they went their own way. And the Russians famously have gone their own way. No, not because there wasn't trying by the Americans to have them be a vassal. Not that there weren't Russians who didn't want that, but that's ultimately the way the power shaped out in Russia. And because I would say that the reality of the 90s were so cruel, and it was so understood that that cruelty that the Russians were exposed to came from the profit taking of the United States at their expense. Right. I mean, the Europeans, though, they have chosen to remain vassals. You have leaders in Europe right now who view the maintenance of the status quo as the most important thing. So when you look at these people in power, Meloni, Macron, Starmer, Merz, van der Leyen, you see men and women who are the Scandinavians. I just saw Scandinavians talking at the big USAA, the big army convention. American Army is having their major convention going on right now, and I've seen some of the Scandinavians talking there, and they sound like the most fervent promoters of American imperialism that you could ever outsource to. The desire to maintain the status quo, because what they believe is that what they have is better than anything else. They see no prospect of operating without the United States that would keep them as secure as they are now in their own power and their own privileges. Not talking about their people, not talking about their societies or their countries, but they themselves. That they themselves, their political parties, are in the best place they could be, remaining as America's vassals, then by striking out. And certainly there is an opportunity they could have done that. I believe there still is an opportunity that is rapidly closing for them to do so. Certainly in the last few years, the Europeans could have said no. And as the multipolar world that we now live in fills itself and forms itself out, and you have different spheres, and you have an American presence, a Chinese presence, a Russian presence, expect to see maybe an Indian one, and we could guess about other countries, having major roles. The Europeans could have been their own separate power in this multipolar world. We've talked about this before. After the Cold War ended, if the Europeans had gone their own way, Europe could be the center of technology. It could be a center of education. It could be what the world looks to for enlightened society, if you will. They chose not to do that. They chose to go along with the American empire, go along with the empire's wars, go along with the empire's policies, go along with the neoliberal policies of the empire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so here you are with unpopular leaders in Europe who are neglecting their populations because they view what's in their own best interest as continuing to pursue the policies that have caused great harm and immiseration and privation for their populations. But that's the best way for them to stay in power. So they continue to do so. And then so as an extension of that, this war in Ukraine then is what they have their flag planted on. This is what their identity is. What identity does Starmer or Macron or Merz or van der Leyen have other than that of I'm standing up to the Russians, right? There's really not anything. So this way, this manner, as you see the United States continue to isolate itself or do everything it can to push other nations to find alternatives to American dominance, the Europeans are staying with them. So eventually you will have a very observable American European bloc, if you will, that is squared off in one way or another with other parts of the world. It's interesting to see the Japanese putting in place their prime minister today, who is incredibly hawkish. Anthony Albanese, the Australian prime minister, was just in the United States this week, signing a tens of billions dollar deal for nuclear submarines, signed under the Biden administration, reaffirmed under this Trump administration. But so you see nations like that reaffirming their commitment to the American empire, when the smart thing for them to do would either be to strike out on their own or find some type of alternative to the empire that they can be a part of.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always. I think the situation with Europe is, we're going to talk about Europe more as time goes by, because the situation with Russia is somehow, Europe is running the show in Ukraine. Europe is running the show.
I think there's been some give and pull between the Americans and the Europeans on this. This idea with the Europeans: look, if you support us on Ukraine, we'll support you on Iran. Treaty Parsi of the Quincy Institute has written a lot on this, and I think he's exactly right. That why did the Germans, the French, and the Brits, the E3 as they're called, be so hard on Iran, like so vigorously pursue snapback sanctions on the Iranians, is in exchange for American support for Ukraine, right? So I mean, I think there's that, and then over top of this, we can't be forgetting is the EU. Is Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas. And you see these women, when they speak about arming their nations, when they speak about a European Union army, when they speak about war, you see this twinkle in their eyes. And so you have these megalomaniacs, in positions throughout that view militarism and war as their pathway to either hold power, or in the case of von der Leyen and Kallas and others in the EU, as a way to create power. Von der Leyen, I don't think she's laying awake at night thinking about, her possibly being the first commander in chief of the European Union army that has been dreamt about for decades, So, yeah.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dima.
Thank you so much, Matt. Great pleasure.